Good to see everybody on. Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin Kawchak. I'm the founder and CEO of Chemical Q Device. This is Thursday, May 23rd, 2024. We're going to be talking about how to develop APIs for generative AI drug discovery production. So if you've done any of this before, this is the business end of LLMs, right? So you can't send all of this information to a client and expect them to know what temperature is and to change the different settings related to Gen AI and LLMs. So basically, it's a client-server interaction. So you have a web app browser traditionally is requesting through the internet to the API and then to the web server. And this goes back and forth, and I'll get into a little bit more of the complexities. And if you talk about APIs, we're typically talking about REST APIs. So REST is still the number one. I've seen up to 90+% of developers use REST APIs. And I'll show you in the next slide as far as the key characteristics that kind of define that. So you're typically talking about either a mobile application, web application, legacy apps, application servers, cloud-based services, partner applications, cloud resources, these types of things, and also with data as well. And this is general, like the biggest thing here is the principles. So the principles behind REST APIs is they're cacheable, code on demand, stateless, layered system, uniform interface, and client server, which kind of I highlighted that before. And also with the methods themselves, if you've ever heard of CRUD, it's similar to CRUD, which I'll show you in the next slide. But most requests are either put or get. There's also post and delete as well. And there's these other aspects to REST as well that kind of give it, you're trying to reach this restful state is what they call it in industry. And have you reached true restfulness? And basically, there's a number of boxes to check off with that. So what you'll see here is basically representational state transfer. It's thought to be scalable, high performing, and basically this author here for IBM Technology gave an example of HTTP icecream.com API and flavor is the resource. So it goes back and forth between the response and the request with this to either get flavors, update flavors, create flavors, and typically, or what it is basically it's stateless. So you wouldn't send all of this additional information. You send only what's required for a specific, put or get. And so you're not typically sending patient data or anything like that. However, if you're using a large language model and it's online, you would need to access that large language model with your data. So that would require sending your data to the LLM for that specific part in order to complete it. And that's why you'll see a lot of the pushes to go local. We'll probably have the biggest use case of LLMs this fall with Apple, especially saying with OpenELM. I think they're also using OpenAI as well. So we're going to see these types of things go, keep going more into privacy. So they're basically micro LLMs on your phone. Using APIs and these types of things. So it's essentially abstracting only what you need instead of, when you're developing, having to look at everything all at the same time. So you'll hear that term. Now, what I include here is basically this, is you have these three API options. This first one is by Matthew Berman, and he uses OpenLLM, Conda as an environment, and Falcon in the next slide. Basically, you have Python as well. So this first API option is basically, this is in terminal, right? So if you've only been using Colab, this is probably, you want to step up to something like a VS Code. Now, keep in mind, Colab has great GPUs for the price. And, something like GitHub Codespaces has VS Code. And you can essentially, I can keep like at least 5 notebooks open, or they're not active, but they're open. So if I go to access them again, it's just where I started off before, maybe not the terminal code. So basically, you're typing all of this into the terminal. So you have conda create n, and then he's creating this OL. So that's his specific use case for this. And he's using this Python conda activate pip install OpenLLM. Now, if you haven't heard of OpenLLM, it's a huge positive. Now, at the time that he did this in 2023, there were relatively few number of options available for LLMs that he could use. And obviously, with Llama 2 coming out, later last year, or I'm sorry, it was actually July of last year, I could just see some of these old models on there, but it's basically a lot of the models that you can get on Hugging Face, you can also use with OpenLLM. Now, OpenLLM also gives you access to VLLM, which is essentially page attention, and that speeds up models specifically or significantly, and I'll show you that a little bit later. So you're running this open LLM, and you're going to start opt. Now, in this specific case, start opt it's a Facebook LLM. It's small, and he says conda activate, so it sends it to this specific documentation. So I was able to do all this, on my own pretty well. When I sent it, in his case, he's able to. You're just supposed to be able to change what's in the quotes, and then you're essentially inferencing the model, in the specific documentation. Okay. And so that one, I could get the same kind of layout that he did, but it's just keep trying to make fixes. And sometimes you have to correct other issues. So if this is a little bit later, so 6+ months, some of these can change and sometimes you have to address certain things. So it's always good, especially for Gen AI, to get the most recent software. But anyways, this is a very good tutorial to go through. So he calls it API for open source models, easy build with any open source LLM. All right, so this is last year. So it's relatively short. I think somewhere between 7 and 11 minutes, something like that. But it's a good step in. So again, you'll have to have something probably beyond. You can do Colab terminal, but I don't think you could do Python scripts. I think it's just Python notebooks, and that's where you kind of need to have this more traditional kind of layout. Now, the second part here, this is the same API option as to install Falcon. So Falcon is a bigger model than that previous opt model, this Facebook model. And he deploys it and he gives it a different question, a more challenging question. Explain to me the difference between further and farther. And on his, it worked pretty well. So I watched this a number of times. And like, again, I was still trying to, fix that main thing where I can change my prompt and then get my specific, what does this mean for, cancer drug discovery, what in specific, that type of thing. And I was just getting a little bit different format, but it seemed like it was working. It was just, I didn't have access to that changeable prompt right there. So he says, this is easy to use. And he's referring to this whole turning LLMs to APIs. I'm so excited for this project, meaning OpenLLM, because one of the biggest limiting factors of using open source models as an engineer was how difficult it was to build on top of them. But now this is a dead simple interface for building on top of these open source models. So if you want to reach to the point of production deployment, you're going to have to use APIs. And in most of these cases, basically it'll give you this localhost 3000 or so. I think it's 127.0.0, something like that. And when you click on it, if you're using a cloud-based IDE, you have to click on that link. You can't copy and paste that because that would essentially mean that your Chrome browser, whatever you're using, is trying to access it locally. So that's another tip there too. So anyways, it's really worth to check this out because you get to this kind of like endpoint in specific here, and then you can run like the updated LLMs, the 2024s. And like in my case, I'm trying to use it for, drug discovery applications. Okay, so this next one is basically if you go to, so Bento ML runs OpenLLM. So the one that I talked about previously. And this is on their GitHub landing page, and it's called something like Llama 2. And it seems to be a very comprehensive notebook as far as just taking something, like the LLM and then turning it into production, right? Like this API. So, say for instance, you want to install OpenLLM with Llama and VLLM, and VLLM is kind of like this. It gets you a lot faster. OpenLLM and LangChain. Now, if you've missed previous calls, basically, so Llama is Facebook's, is Meta's. So it's like it's not just Facebook. It's say, for instance, if it was Llama 2 at the time where they made this. And then also OpenAI is, they'll be collaborating with Apple. LangChain is the leading OpenAI or the leading developer platform for Gen AI. So that's the thing right there is, a lot of these, they'll call them chain together, or you can use LangGraph. you can use Langsmith to kind of monitor everything in a separate browser tab. And then you can also use LangServe, which I'll show you on the next one, the next API option. So in specific, we see all of this, and I got to the end here. I got to this point here with I could either use sync or async, and then I had some issue, and it seemed to be some GPU issue. So I tried, instead of apt, I tried pip. So apt is more if you're just doing something for more stability reasons, and then pip is something to try to it's most recent. And those didn't work, but I'll show you in the next slide as far as how far they got with theirs to the end of it. Now, the LLM that they chose to use here is this Nui's Hermes Llama 2. If you try to get Llama 3, I know, and I think with Llama 2, you first have to get kind of approved. And then every time you go to use their model in any of these, you're going to have to provide an API token. Now, the Nui's Hermes in specific, I think it kind of gets around that. It shouldn't, but I don't think you need the API key to run this specific notebook. So, and I also changed mine to get this to run better. It's bfloat instead of float 16. So that helped me get through some of these first lines in code. And like, again, you'll see VLLM here, and here's the 127.0.0. So every time this shows up, and this is actually in a Colab notebook. So there's no Python scripts. And then you would actually click on this. And there's also a time in the lower right-hand corner, you can click on it and it'll send you to the server in order to, do additional steps. So like I said, with the previous one, I was able to get there. So I don't think it was some issue with the, these server links at all. I think it was some other issue. I don't think it was anything related to Chrome browser. And, so basically asked, what is the weight of the earth? And this is setting up as far as, the two different types of APIs that I choose to use here. Now, they were able to complete it with this specific notebook. And this is the Bento Cloud API overview. And this is basically getting closer to these steps of saying like, oh, okay, now this is ready for deployment. And in specific, you want to be able to reach to this point right here. Okay, so VLLM is, if you can use VLLM, you really want to use it. So it's called page detention algorithm, which stores continuous keys and values in non-contiguous memory space. It was borrowed from some other type of tech that was previously existing. And you see here from the results, and the higher, the better here. We're measuring in throughput at requests per minute. So Hugging Face to TGI to VLLM, significantly, higher throughput. So what's shown here on the left is a bigger Llama. So a Llama 13 billion parameter, A140 gig, which by the way is still up on Colab, which we'll probably see a refresh pretty soon here. And then this next one here, the 7 billion parameter with a 10 gigabyte, the A10G. So, I've heard in other discussions too, is you really want to use VLLM, when you can. Now, I don't know what else besides that VLLM has. I just know that that's their key feature, that you can turn this, you can toggle it. So once you get your model, have your not model defined, then it's model.vllm, and then that sets it to true. Okay, so model.vllm turns on the VLLM. So when you're exploring these, and again, with these past couple, we're typically talking about Hugging Face models here, and you can kind of see the landscape between everything, at this point, because I've covered, in-depth Gen AI the last, 6-8 weeks, something like that. And you can kind of see all these pieces merging together. And even if people seem to be like competitors, a lot of times you'll see at least some compatibility with OpenAI. Probably, I believe, having a lot of this kind of like starting off with the whole, try to have things as open source, although they do have proprietary models. So, the interconnects seem to be very good. And coming from other different techs that I've covered in machine learning, there's just so many different options as far as accessing models. If you want to access directly on Hugging Face, if you want to use OpenLLM, if you want to use these other platforms, OpenAI has a lot of options there too. And it's really good to see, especially with this tech going into the fall, especially that a lot of this will see the biggest use cases of LLMs for Gen AI with the phones. I think it's iOS 18 is what it'll be up to. And I'm assuming, at least recent, iPhones will be able to run that as well. So it's just, if you're looking ever to research a specific technology, I would definitely get into generative AI because we have the hundreds of millions of dollars that each manufacturer puts into training models these days. This is OpenAI. They've spent way more than hundreds of millions. This is Llama 3, the most recent one, over $100 million. And that's your starting point. Like that software model with those parameters or the weights is your launching point to either further fine tune it, to use retrieval augmented generation. It's really like there's so many different options to now make it your personal research tool. Okay, so the next one is basically this. Is I covered LangChain last week. So LangChain is basically the #1 Gen AI developer platform. So they have Langsmith, which is basically, it puts everything into a separate tab in your Chrome and all the outputs and all that stuff. And it puts all the times of every single run. And you can see the data that it was looking at in order that they use that data for, that response for the LLM. It's got a lot of cool features. Now, this specific demo, this is on LangChain, so this is on YouTube. So, first step, install LangChain's command line interface, and then he's calling this new app, My App is what we'll be using. Now, if you look at LangChain's GitHub, it is just full of all these different resources that you can use. This specific one, he calls it pirate speak. So whatever thing you type in, it'll respond in what it sounds like a pirate would talk like. And you can modify this, okay? So in that directory in GitHub, when you access this correctly and it sends it to your VS Code or whatever you're using, you'll get, in this case, we mostly use 2 different Python scripts to either modify and utilize in order to get to the API to use. Okay, so then basically you just have to point it. It's this cursor dot, or in my case it was code dot, that sends it these instructions to my VS Code to pull up this pirate speak directory from LangChain. And I think this is in their templates. So if you're just kind of like poking around, this is a good place to start. You'll probably need some additional help, like with these seminars. I probably watched over 10 seminars this week, and I'll get to one later on. It was a 3-hour one, kind of like the 101s on APIs. So if you use OpenAI, you have to use, in this case, in a terminal, you would use export. If you use it in, like a Colab environment, I think you can use this, but you can also use like OS, import OS is typically what works best for me. So what happens is while you're in the terminal, is you get this specific, and it doesn't show in the terminal, it won't be in color. And you copy and paste this into the appropriate script, okay? And then after that, you go LangChain serve. So all these steps worked well for me. And again, you'll need something like, again, I don't think these will work too well like this if there's Python scripts, if you're still trying to use Colab. So a lot of these are kind of like, you've probably already trained your model or fine-tuned your model with Colab GPU or did it locally or some other service. And then when you're dealing with these kind of like interactions between terminal, Python scripts, that type of environment, you need something more like a VS Code. And so basically, he was able to get to this. So this Fast API docs, and Fast API is used, across a lot of these different demos as well. And so they show after that is kind of like some LangChain settings, and you have to show your LangChain API key. I know that for sure. And then you have to wind up on GitHub. You have your repo, and then this goes into this is basically the launching point for your API. Now, I believe there's still a waiting list on this LangServe as far as, who gets what, when, because it's probably dependent on your project and these types of things. But anyways, you can have APIs. It doesn't have to be LangServe, and you can get to certain points using LangChain and Langsmith, and then use some other type of service as well. So here you see here. So length serve is cool, exclamation point. And it says R, length serve be a jolly good ship. So that's specific to the pirate speak, okay? Now, if I want to use it for drug discovery, then I can find more appropriate templates, or I could create my own scripts and say it'll point, in a direction more like, tell me in specific, like I need a drug candidate with these 5 different biochemical properties, so it's these things are good to see because there's multiple different ways. I also ran another one and I wasn't as happy with it. So I focused on these 3. And I think it's a good launching point too. So in a nutshell, APIs or application programming interfaces are for extensive Gen AI deployment. Web apps and browsers are stateless, but information is online when running your LLMs, right? So even though you're not sending all of that information back and forth, if you have to access the LLM and it's online, that means somewhere across the internet, you're going to be sending your data. So if you don't want to do that, it's called on-prem or basically, or more on-device, APIs for on-device LLMs are necessary for abstraction, convenience, and data safety. Now, the whole thing with abstraction is basically you're not focusing on all these, technical details at this point. You're just giving, your client, say, what color ice cream do you want? Or what color this? And then it goes back and forth from, the client to the server. And, with Apple and everything it does, data safety is a huge concern. And, basically they use core ML. There's also TensorFlow Lite, PyTorch Mobile. So these are all local solutions, but you're going to see a lot of this. And I keep seeing it on my feed on LinkedIn as well, as far as, run this local, like local LLMs. Now, generative AI drug discovery needs continual REST API incorporation or uses it. Over 93% of API developers are using REST as of 2022. It's easy to learn. There's a wide range of data transfer, statelessness, and scalability. So, that's why, if you're sending too much information, these types of things, I think that interacts with not being as scalable. And it's typically just one thing at a time. And, there's some things you keep with the client, some things you keep with the server, and that's like REST API. However, there was one of the broadcasters says it needs built-in security and versioning for backwards compatibility. And I've heard kind of things as far as like, yes and no on that middle one, and then URI consistency as well. Now, as far as what's available today, for cancer, generative AI is basically you could use LangChain Python, your choice of LLM manufacturer, OpenLLM, Python, Conda, choice of LLM as the second one. And the third one, VLLM, OpenLLM, Python, and your choice, right? So you're going to see a lot more of these, I think, in that kind of like terminal, Python script environment as opposed to the Colab. And I took this boot camp. I took this 3-hour discussion here. It's a seminar. It's from Free Code Camp. It's by Craig Dennis. And it's great for me to learn it as far as the 101s on APIs. And he says, we just need to know what we've been allowed to change or see. Interfaces abstract away the implementation. Now with the UI or user interface is made for the user of the application. The API is made for the application programmer to use and extend in their applications. So, it's a really good code camp because we went through a lot of different, there's Spotify example, there's Twilio, like this is like kind of like setting up call centers, that type of stuff. And, it's just good to see all the different interactions with APIs is how we see today is kind of like this, final deployment that, is able to interact with clients and servers. So are there any questions? And feel free to put in the chat as well. Now, what's going on right now with all of this, with LLMs, is it's just awesome news right now, right? So right now you can access grok.com, GROQ, you have to sign up a little bit. You have access to at least four different LLMs to do direct inference. And you could use that for research. Say as a starting point, go to Grok and then type the same phrase in and change it from Llama 3, 7 billion parameter to 80 billion parameter. And you could do, it's called Mistral, or it's actually Mixtral, mixture of experts. That's one thing that you can do. Now, if you're into Google and the Google Suite, if you check your admin.google, I think it's an opt-in for Google Business Gemini right now. And it gives you Gemini 1.0. So it's basically, you have access to upload photos, text, speech, it's multimodal. And it's showing up on all my other services too. So I use, Sheets and slides and those types of things. And you're going to see all of this generative AI just completely go across all of these areas because it works good enough now. There's heavy competition between all of the different, LLM manufacturers. And on top of that, you still have ChatGPT, which is probably still the best for code if you have issues with your code. You have Meta.ai, which is tied into your Facebook account, and that's the 70 billion parameter for inference. And you have HuggingFace.co, and that's another generative AI model. And I think it's aimed more towards Hugging Face issues, like Hugging Face code, and that runs off of Cohere. So with all this going on, and we heard that Apple is, partnering with OpenAI, and Apple also has their own LLMs. And, with the new software updates going into the fall and the new phones coming out too, is they made, I think at the last Apple event, it was a very strong commitment to AI and kind of very strong hints at using generative AI, much more. So I think it's here to stay. And I think it's the best time to get into it now. It takes many, many weeks, if not months, to master generative AI. If you're running Colab notebooks or if you're doing, VS Code projects like this with APIs, but you really want to focus on, the work, doing the actual work of generative AI. And I think that that's job security into the future because you'll know, what the, issues are with software, even that as it gets good enough to kind of code on its own. So obviously this particular discussion focused on the practical aspect of using APIs and abstracting this other information that's not needed for the client to see over here on the left. And now, it's APIs will be used, for web app and browsers, locally, these types of things. And it's an important part of generative AI, is basically serving your models to some extent. So yeah, feel free to put in the chat. And like I said, there's just a lot of good news. I think it's the breaking into, just full out adoption of the technology. There's, these other issues that it has, but even something like Lane Chain or like Lane Smith, you can see if there was an issue, and you can either run it again, or you can, just do a straight search or these types of things, right? So a lot of these issues are known. And, it just seems like the sky is the limit as far as, adoption. And you're going to hear a lot from a lot of companies. I think Google took their time switching from Bard to Gemini. And the search, or if you go to Gemini search right now, if you have a Google account, it should work pretty well. It's just, it's generative, right? So you get a lot more complex, substantive answers. And sometimes it'll pop up in Google search as well. So this technology is being applied in all these different places. And Gemini and others like Meta.ai, it sometimes even gives you references too. It just depends on the question and those types of things. So, I think this is the time, right? So this is the time to, everybody's seen generative AI for enough. And, it's getting full support from a lot of these huge companies, NVIDIA, and you'll see agentic workflows like from NVIDIA and others too, kind of giving the software more autonomy. Yeah, so I saw at least a couple people join, and then so feel free to put in the chat, if you have any specific questions or comments with this, and you know, I I want to stress again, like if you're not actively working on generative AI with the notebooks, you know, uh, watching seminars, code alongs while they code, you code too. Just try to get the thing to work is the biggest thing. So we do have a question here. Besides using the latest LLMs, is there a chance that it can skip some of the latest data? Yeah, so that whole thing, so if you missed some of the previous talks, is retrieval augmented generation. And that basically, when you have a trained model like Llama 3, 8 billion parameter or 70 billion parameter, you can use RAG as the abbreviation for that acronym I just said. And you can just, so it augments the generated response. So instead of just saying like, okay, all of this was based on if it was March 2023 when that Llama 3 model was trained, which is newer than some of the other LLMs, by the way, is that you can now point it. So the best RAG model I found was Raptor, and I gave it 3 sources. So I gave it a good paper, a drug discovery paper, and I gave it 2 of my presentations. So they were shorter than like a big paper. And it did better as the model got better and the context was more on key as it got to like a bigger model, right? So that's typically what you find if you're stuck in a GPT-2 as opposed to 4.0. Like a 4.0 is like is really good right now. And some will cost you a little bit more on input and output tokens. So meaning an input token is basically say how many dogs exist in the US, something like that. You have to count those tokens. Those are input tokens, and it corresponds to words, but they're in numbers. Okay, so the software wants to see numbers. Now the output tokens, if you set 128, max tokens, it'll give that many, and it's approximate number of words, in return. So something like 4.0 right now is like 10x the cost of a 3.5 turbo for OpenAI. So some of these things you can hop back on and off, OpenAI to check out how much money you're spending there. Okay, so he says, if so, what are the ways to using scraping pipelines for very targeted research on web knowledge? Again, these are all in the demos, right? So I've covered these. There's a lot. So the Langsmith, if you want to go through those tutorials, I would actually watch some of the previous talks on YouTube here. And again, this presentation will be up on GitHub, and then all of the presentations are up on YouTube there. So, everybody can find that there. But yeah, it's a very common thing is to scrape, and it tries to obey this robot.txt as far as not just scraping endlessly. But, typically you point it to a specific source. So like I said, the Raptor that I used, and it has some, words that associate with that acronym, is I was able to do 3 at a time. And I think for each of them, you can kind of set as far as if you want to use Pydantic for one, or, it just depends on how you want to search that specific document. Now, before all this, I gave some presentations on, it's called ChemCrow. So ChemCrow uses a large language model. They use ChatGPT-4, and they used 18 different tools. And at using ChatGPT-4 and more like an agent, it accesses these tools as it needs it. So one of the tools is like a reaction finder. One of these tools was like, safety check to say, if somebody prompts in a sentence or two and it sends it to an automated synthesizer to create the molecules, there's a check for that too, that it won't create that molecule if it's something like that. So there's, robo reactions pretty good. Some of the groups, more of the chemistry related biochem is LAM MIT has done generated proteins based on unfolding strength, right? So if you want a specific protein with this specific strength, it did a better job than the previous papers at doing that, right? So you're going to see that as far as more specific applications. And in my opinion, even the base LLMs will get so good because a lot of them are already trained off of medical literature, medical data sets. biochemistry, you have physics, you have biotechnology, you have pharmacology. So Meta.ai, I asked it, several weeks ago, and it told me all these data sets that it's trained on, but it wasn't trained in that specific a manner to use it as a research tool. It kind of like dreams up this whole thing, but you would probably have to use something like RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, to further point it. You can also fine tune. So fine tuning is basically you have your LLM and you have some of these extra parameters, and you're tacking on some extra parameters, and those parameters are focused on your new data set. Okay. So I did that, and it was a data set that the base model was already trained on, but it didn't do as well as if I, again, pointed it to say, RAG this specific data set and give me these kind of R&D quality results. And again, there's checks and there's all these types of things in workflows right now. And it's literally like this new era is beginning in healthcare. And we see, all these tools being used. And of course, I'm somewhere in the middle, because like on one end, companies there was a drug discovery company that said, we're using this package from NVIDIA. Okay. That's one end. I'm in the middle, and then there's people that custom code, because I'll work off a bunch of demos and kind of build and piece things together. And there's some people that just custom code, all their scripts, and these types of people too. So I think in all these things, no matter what your approach is you have to keep up with the best technology. So when you talk about more so with RAG, inference RAG, that's big. And that's bigger than the other types of RAG for other types of LLM applications. And agentic workflows. And then beyond that, there's chaining, right? So you could literally say, if this was acceptable, yes, it goes this step. No, it goes back and does it again, right? And we see that with LangGraph and LangChain. But yeah, all these things, as far as the questions here, they shouldn't be too hard to find. And again, I would start with my stuff too, because I focus kind of like on the demos that work the best. Because I'll sit down, one of these LangChain videos is like 2.5 hours, and I'll go through that. And I might only include a specific portion of those notebooks that we cover, right? So it comes down to this. It's like, what do you want to do? And a lot of times with Gen AI and LLMs, people just get overwhelmed, or they'll, lose their balance. Or you have to focus. Like if you log on to huggingface.co right now, that confuses people, because they see all these boxes and they think you have to go through all that stuff. But it's really like, if you just want to use text generation, if you go to the main leaderboard and you click on Llama 3, that's a text generation model. Okay. So you're going to have a Colab notebook, at least, that corresponds to that. And instead of running that text generation Llama model after you get approval, then you just switch what's in the quotes to some other text generation model. Okay. So that makes things 10 times simpler. And if you need to do multimodal stuff, I would say that's kind of get it a little bit more advanced if you want to do it for R&D. And I would start off with Gemini. Just type to Gemini Google, and it'll start to redirect to it's like ChatGPT, but for Google. And it does multimodal. So I uploaded an image, and then it couldn't do high resolution of it, but it can do other things with it. And you'll come across payment tiers and all this type of stuff. But, I really see this is the inflection point, and this is the perfect time to get into Gen AI from an R&D perspective, right? Because it's gone through so many, just reading this quote at the end, or actually it was this one, because one of the biggest limiting factors of using as an engineer was how difficult it was to build on top of these, right? The LLMs. So you can't use tech that you can't go anywhere with. And again, I've been on platforms where there was just one big one platform and it looked awesome, right? But the majority of it wasn't high performance and it was slow. So you have to find what works for you. And I'm sorry, you have to find what works in industry, and then you use it. So, I just don't see any drawbacks in researching with this. And it's like with anything, there's learning curves, but I don't think it's necessarily rocket science. Like there's a big component is memorization because you have to know, I'm running a Meta Llama 3 on Hugging Face versus I'm using OpenAI's GPT 4.0, and then I'm using so many tokens there. So that's a big aspect is you just have to be able to discern and see what all is in the industry. But if you don't get in now, all this stuff will happen this fall, and it's just going to be it's going to get a lot more awesome from here. Everywhere from the models, changing architectures, these types of things. But it's reached that point where it's a pretty for sure thing. And we can thank OpenAI and others for leading this. And they went through many iterations with their LLMs, right? So it just didn't fall out of the sky. And now, like I said, if you go to Google search and if it's a complex question, on mine, at least, it'll try to answer it using Gemini, generative AI. So, and it actually cites some sources too. So if you want to check and see if there was some hiccup or something like that, you can go straight to the sources too. Yeah, and keep the questions coming for sure. And for those kind of just joining on at this point, it's kind of like you're either in Gen AI, like you're actively researching it, or you're not. And as I mentioned before, there's an explosion of these very functional chat models. And it's not just Chat GPT, Meta.ai, Grok, Hugging Face more for Hugging Face, Gemini. And, it's a thing now, right? Like, so people trust it a lot more. And again, there's fail safes too, like as far as get a specific bad answer, run it again, or go some other pipeline, those types of things as well. Is there anybody that we haven't heard from? And some things are just specific. So this is Bento Cloud, and they call things Bento. They say log into Bento Cloud and push the bento to it. Okay, so bento I think is actually a small Japanese meal. So there's just a lot of active development around it. And if you look at on Discord, LangChain has the biggest one. They have the biggest developer community. You can post your events. You can ask questions, and it seems like people are answering questions, which are a good thing. Yeah, but there's just all this other kind of active communities to participate, ask questions. And by the way, IBM partnered with Mistral. Mistral for the longest time was the Apache 2, like the purest sense of open sourceness of models. So they say they'll still have open source and they'll have some commercial too. So that's going to be IBM's use of LLMs is through Mistral. So you can get Mistrals, the open source. You should be able to still get them online, like on Hugging Face. So that's how it is. And like I said, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll see if I can get some Hugging Face here. But that's my goal, right? Is if you attend these, I really would be awesome for people to let's see. Okay. To hop on. Okay. So basically, I would start with something like Hugging Face. Okay. So if you go to Hugging Face and you go to pipelines, so unfortunately, their search is a little bit different. If you hit enter, it'll just go there. Now, if you go to, let's see, and I don't want to navigate off this specific what, but a lot of these, it'll just give you information in the model cards, and it'll say, these are the snips of code. Now, most people access Hugging Face through here, okay? So I actually haven't seen the leaderboard in a couple days, maybe a week, something like that. And what you see here is basically on the left, you have the types of models, okay? So you don't have to memorize all of these. You'll probably just use one or two, right? But if I go to text generation, and control. Actually, some of these will take me right there. And this is actually the leaderboard. So number one is by OpenBNB, and it's a Llama 3 this, okay? So what it means is this specific model should be fine-tuned off the original Llama 3. And there's this thing called context window that's kind of buzzing right now. So what context window gets you is you can potentially avoid using RAG, and you just put it all into memory, right? So the context window, you could shove like 3 decent documents in it. If it's like Gemini, which stores 2 million tokens at this point. And, so you'll see these types of developments. Now, the thing that throws it off, or they also say, so 8.54, this is the number of parameters of Llama 3. And, you keep scrolling through all this, and, so people will go through and further improve Llama 3, which is good to see too. So if you go back to, let's see, models, you see Microsoft just had some new announcements, it looks like. And, so here's the original Llama 3 8 billion parameter. Now, one of the kinks right now with the meta llamas is they don't tell you the training data. And it's probably be really hard to reproduce anyway, because it took so many GPUs and hours to do. So what people do, I think this is how people do it, is they'll take it and you'll find the architecture for Llama 3 8 billion parameter, and you'll insert your architecture, your Python code, and you'll run it on some data set, and then you'll run the original Llama 3 8 billion parameter on the same data set, and then you can compare that. I've seen that done before. So I've used this instruct a lot. Now, the difference between the original and instruct is it has additional, work with it to make it more ask a question and it gives an answer. So there's certain times you want to use these models when it's, just the plain models. Say if I were to access the GPT-4o on OpenAI, that's more of a case where, I'm not using an instruct model, I'm using the plain model. So these models get updated a lot. Like this is the leaderboard right now. And Mistral, who I said, this should still be Apache 2. We'll see. Yeah, so it's Apache 2, which is very open source. And actually, there are some that are MIT as well. And this is the one, they just partnered with IBM. And now they're saying they're going to have these open source models and, commercial models. So you really want to stay up to date with it. And so if you're just starting off, I'd use something like, it's called pipelines, and I'll get to that in a second. But if you go to text generation, these will be the top text generation models. If you get a Colab notebook that works well with text generation, in theory, a lot of these should work. Now, the Meta Llama, you have to get approval. But a lot of these other ones, especially if they're smaller and older, you can just use, right? They won't ask you for your Hugging Face token. So you go through all of these and you see kind of like, what's new. And the one that was popping up to me, like I think 2 or 3 weeks ago was, it was a gradient instruct, and it turned basically this context window of like 8,000 to like 1 million, right? So that's the new Llama 3. So I don't see it, and these get updated so often to go through. So what would help is basically, if I go to this specific one, which should be Hugging Face pipelines. So this is pipelines, and all you have to do is you're going to have, you copy and paste this. Okay, you just hit this copy code excerpt. And then the type of pipeline, so this would be a text classification. And actually, this is more like sentiment analysis. And when you say this restaurant is awesome, positive, it thinks 99.989%, something like that, this is a positive statement based on your, the model that this is using. So when I first started off, I do this is I'd find these pipelines and I just start building, right? And I can incorporate all these things with like biochemistry and, different aspects of, the proteins, isoelectric points, these types of things. And a lot of them, they'll have this portion where you can use pipelines. So in this specific one, they're substituting for this Facebook Roberta large, and it says, this restaurant is awesome. And then this one didn't do as well. We know this is a positive statement, but it said that it's 73% this is neutral, okay? So in other words, this model did not work well. However, the more recent Meta ones, which is based on, Facebook, would likely do much better. Okay, so that's an example of that. And that's just one of them. So say, for instance, if they say text classification, okay, so here should be the task. So you can do all sorts of these. So you can do, it's called audio classification. You can do automatic speech recognition. So this is, I would highlight this specific one and go back to it. So it says, Transformers English task summary. Okay, what Transformers can do. And these are going to be reflective of those subjects and the core Hugging Face documentation. Image classification, and we've been doing this for years. And some of these things we still need, right? So if you have like an agentic workflow and you have to classify an image, you probably won't use a large language model, right? So there's certain things that Gen AI is more focused at, like these more kind of complex, you type in a sentence or two, or even Andrew Ng says, we'll start to type in a page, and your Gen AI will just go across the internet for half an hour, figure out your page of queries instead of just a sentence or two. And then it'll just, it would take a lot of time for a human to do these things. Image segmentation, depth estimation, NLP, text classification, which we saw previously, token classification. So each of these, it'll show up as a specific, so here's sentiment analysis, it is text classification. So what that means is basically Hugging Face is the best thing since sliced bread. And it says that 99.91%, that's a positive statement, right? And you'll start to see differences in LLMs, right? Older LLMs, smaller LLMs, just not nearly as high of performance. And here we go. So I've talked about Google Gemini for a while. And, the whole thing, especially, it's going to be on Apple iPhones, I believe, this fall. So you'll input not just text, but say like video off your live camera or something like that. And you start to think just the number of applications that it could take your specific, live video or recording of a video and turn that into some type of generated response using AI, okay? So I think what we'll first see is something, they actually did announce that they would do this, is that we're gonna see this. So I think in the first kind of iOS updates, we're gonna see summarization. So, and you could look online for this too. And then we're going to see, I think that's a key one, but it'll just keep opening up and opening up. And like I said, basically the whole industry of, and even agencies like regulatory agencies appear to be, very behind the technology. Obviously, everybody wants it to work the best. So when you're talking about patient data, there's just no, you can't use certain things, like for diagnostics right away today, right? It's not approved, but for drug discovery and figuring out drug candidates, that would make better sense anyway. And then we can test it all along the steps. That's something that's a little bit, it's not as strict as something like a direct diagnosis. And are there any questions at this point? So this is a key one, is Hugging Face. And it's really up to you. But that's my wish for everybody that comes to this discussion, and I go to others too, is basically, be assertive, find the notebooks. I've put up a ton of notebooks, Gen AI, drug discovery, LLMs, LangChain, and like the sky's the limit at this point. I really don't see a whole lot holding it back. And it's driven by what people want, right? So people want advanced functionality on their phones. And so we'll see this in drug discovery and medicine too.
Hi, Kevin. This is Sanju here. Sorry, I was late for this session. I joined like for the last 15 minutes, maybe. Um, First of all, thank you so much for conducting this session. And of course, the last two sessions, because I didn't attend the last two, even though I've tried attending it because of my professional job I had at the meetings. But definitely, I feel very helpful. Um, And I had a chance to visit the NVIDIA conference, which happened, I think, maybe April or March, I don't know. So there I found a company, not company, but uh, a tool maybe called Nemo,
Uh-huh.
BioNemo. I spoke with actually the person who developed it because that was used for drug discovery again, right? Using AI for drug discovery. So that's when I thought of playing around with it, and yeah, a lot of challenges ahead. We are just at the tip of the iceberg now to understand and take this forward. Is it possible for you to share your previous two recordings as well so that I can kind of get the whole picture till now? What?
So everything is up on its Chemical Q device, and so it's on YouTube. Shouldn't be too hard to find. And
Got
then,
it. Okay. Hmm.
that's the best way.
Okay. Okay. I'll search for it and
Yeah, and again,
get the-
this goes for everybody. So all of the PowerPoints, everything is up on GitHub, and usually under this, something like code or on the main page, is pretty easy to find.
okay. Sure. Thank you. Also, I wanted to kind of get this understanding by working practically rather than theoretically, right? There are a lot of um, books and everything out there. So just want to check with you if there is a chance of a quick chat with you, maybe not now, but next week or sometime when you're available, just to understand and see.
So I push everything to the discussion. I have to
Mhm,
I have to watch so many seminars because I have
mhm.
to, apply this to product, like so APIs figure like deployment, production. So everything is just here. And so if there's any questions regarding the material, feel free to ask. Um,
Okay,
but yeah,
sure.
say last year everything's just like code, seminars, right? It's just back to back, and then I got to put this together as well. So yeah, feel free to put anything in the chat if you have any questions. I think the biggest thing you'll find is, you know, it takes some weeks to get up and going with it. And
Hmm.
I got the sense with some people, there's other discussions I'll go to on the weekend, and if somebody said, "Oh yeah, I actually ran this demo that you ran, and it's yeah, it's great to see, right?" So, but you have to cross into that next phase of actively developing in Gen AI. Um,
Hmm.
so a lot of it, if you can't find with me, you have to be resourceful. So you go into GitHub, type into GitHub, and say like, a good search thing is if you type into like Google generative AI notebooks, that'll give you a bunch of Geminis. And those
Hmm.
are actually Apache 2.0. I'm not sure about, the bigger models or whatever. But that's a good source. And LangChain is a good source. But, plan on spending some time. Like, so you got to be honest with yourself. Like, how much time is this going to take? Do I have the time? Is this worth my effort? And I don't encourage anybody to not pursue it. But it takes a significant time to run notebooks because most of the times
Hmm.
they just don't run. And it's kind of it's lucky if they do run. And so it's either you want to find the most recent notebooks too. So like I said, with those sources, LangChain, Gemini, generative AI notebooks, and it's under an individual's name, I think, but there's a lot in there. And, it's kind of like you just have to learn these things and then say like, okay, what would it take to get me to that next level? And I would encourage you to teach other people too, because using the Feynman approach. So now, next week, I really want to push a lot of this into production and say like, okay, I have a link for somebody, this AI model, if they did even something related to, drug discovery, it'd give an answer, based on the server. I might have to keep the server up. But those types of things, right, is you have to cross that point as far as being, now I want to run this. And you do need assistance, like on the weekends, going to AI events. I go to two. But yeah, just kind of that resourcefulness is like, okay, this didn't work. And I'll just keep trying these and I'll keep watching seminars. The LangChain seminars, there's a bunch of code alongs. They had a really good one for code execution. I featured that last week. They had a good one for agents. They had three of them, and I featured, it's the supervisor agent. I featured that notebook. But yeah, just you got to do what you have to do in order to, keep things moving, to get answers, tailor it towards your application, change data sets when you can, those types of things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I also want to leave it open too, if there's anybody else that has any kind of questions or comments here.
Hey, Kevin.
Hey, Ron.
How you doing?
Good.
Good. Just to follow on to that conversation. Yeah, you have to get out there and learn stuff. And whether you're using CodeSpace or CodeLab, the more you know about Linux, the better off you're going to be. The more you know about networking issues, the better off you're going to be. A lot of times when people have a problem with notebooks, it's usually almost always down to an access problem, or they're not running the proper kernel for the proper versions of the frameworks that they're pulling in. So I guess those are just things you kind of learn by trial and error. But like if you run into a networking problem, things just don't work the way you think they should. It could be a networking problem. Like on GitHub's CodeSpace, they have a mechanism to do port forwarding, but sometimes I've run into applications over there that they don't tell you that they're forwarding the port. And so that can be very confusing. And it's just things you got to learn. Like you said, you got to put the time in. So
yeah,
this is another great presentation, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the biggest thing is I burned up a laptop in 4 months running local machine learning. And now I have, just out of the abundance, I have a laptop fan blown here. And you really want to, in my opinion, just do everything online because it saves all the notebooks. And if you don't know what you're doing in terminal, you can mess things up. It's a few number of commands, but that could happen too. But typically you just have just the research. I haven't even, so GitHub code spaces, once you start to really get into it, they'll charge you. But I already launched like at least a dozen of, these VS Code notebooks that give me, I can run scripts, I can run Python notebooks, I can run terminal. And, so it's like practical, right? And I think it avoids some of those things because with port forwarding, yeah, I can't copy the link and put it into the browser. And I think at least one of these, it did work where I click on the link, like control click, and it does port forwarding to send that to the tab. But it's not actually the local 8,000 thing. And there's a blue box that pops up in the lower right-hand corner. So I've heard other people, it's just whatever works for you. And if you just insist on using Anaconda and, you know, these types of things like locally, you know, if that works for you. And I had some issues because if you're installing things and you get out of configuration between some of these that have to work together, and I was just like, you know, my Colab's working, or now I'm more using VS Code. So yeah, I appreciate everybody coming on. Any other last questions or comments? Yeah, so this has been Thursday, May 23rd, 2024. So this is how to develop APIs for generative AI drug discovery production. I appreciate everybody coming on. Have a good rest of the night and have a productive rest of the week. Take care, everybody.